looking for the answers? How do you know what's true? If someone tells you something, does that make it true? How can you tell? When you see the news, is that true or is it made up? If you're taught something in education, is it true or is it selective? Are you getting some information but not the bigger picture? There has been 3 important and entertaining and fascinating experiments done in studying human nature, because we all want to know how people tick. The world is full of a lot of people, so ignore them at your peril. It is quite useful to be able to work out why people do things. Otherwise, the world is a very confusing place. And of course, that's exactly what it is. The world is full of contradictions. People are saying this thing and then doing that. Not that easy to work out what's the right thing to do, who to follow. Should we just take it all with a pinch of salt? Is that possible? So, these experiments, studies into human nature, will give us a clue. Not easy to prove something in a soft science like psychology. You can show traits, tendencies and ideas, but it's not like hard science where you get definite proof, and mathematics and all this type of thing. With a soft science, it's fluid and you can get understandings, and each person's theory can make a positive contribution to their knowledge base. But it's not easy to say anything for certain in the way you can in hard experimental type of science. There's often a polarization of people in academia, where there's a bunch of people who are the hard scientists, engineers, people like that who don't rate the soft science because they think it's just a lot of baloney, and they think unless it's scientific it means nothing. And psychologists try to, over the years, create studies to give them self-proof of human behaviour, predictability. And I would say these 3 experiments are the most accessible and the best experiments that give you a good indication of how people behave. But there is one thing to bear in mind. The studies show something which is quite terrifying about human nature, and it's conclusive. And none of these studies has ever been discredited. So the first one, Ash, was conducted in 1951, the Milgram experiment 1961, and Zimbardo in 1971. The Asch one never really been queried as anything other than the truth. Milgram, terrifying but true. Zimbardo has been questioned but never really discredited. Zimbardo therefore is seen to be credible. And so I'll go through these studies and speak in plain language and give you an idea what these studies actually revealed about how human beings work, and it will then give you some really good insight into what you see around you. It will give you a good idea why people behave the way they do and why there's such extreme things happen in the world. It's all to do with human nature. We are in a modern society with amazing technology, and we can communicate instantaneously. But it seems to just give us a much more efficient way of being silly. We can be very silly and destructive and vicious on a grand scale. So technology exaggerates our traits. If there's a lot of hostility about, then you start to see it all gathering in force on the web, and people can be very vicious. So, worthwhile having a look at why people behave the way they do. So first of all, we've got Asch, an experiment conducted in 1951. This was a very simple experiment about conformity. And what it amounted to, there were, as often happens in psychology, you get people who are being tested in the experiment, but other people who are pretending to be part of the experiment, but they're actually in on it. And therefore, there could be 1, 2, 3, 4 and people who are in on the experiment acting, and one person is being studied to see what that person's reaction is. In order to get the genuine reaction from this person, people have to play a part to fool the person who's been studied. So this is what happened with Asch, and the experiment was about conformity. And it consisted of a room with no distractions and a table and authority people conducting the experiment, and there would be 3 people or 4 people, say, sitting in a row, and they were given simple questions on a piece of paper, an A4 sheet of paper, and they had to answer the question. And the questions were very simple, and that was, you would get perhaps 3 lines, A, B and C, just a line on a piece of paper. Line A would be about 1 inch long. Line B would be clearly longer, maybe 3 inches. And line C would be definitely longer again, maybe double that again, 6 inches. So we've got 3 lines, A, B and C, 1 inch, long, 3 inches and 6 inches. And the piece of paper would be passed to those being tested. And what you get would be open kind of planned testing so that everybody could really see what they were doing, and this was part of the test. So that you got 3 people who were acting and 1 person who was being tested. And so therefore the question was, mark what you believe to be the shortest line on the paper. And it was clear there was a short one, a mid-range one and a long one. But unknown to the 4th person in the row, the first 3 people were going to put the wrong answer. Deliberately. So they would all think about it, and given about a minute to make the decision, the first person would clearly mark the short line as being the longest. He puts the wrong answer, quite obviously. The next person thinks about it, concentrates, and does the same, puts the short line as what he thinks is the longest line. And the third person does the same. He thinks about it, looks at it, and marks the short line A as what he judges is to be the longest one. Clearly the wrong answer. Very obvious. And it comes to the 4th person, and he's the one that's being tested. The other people are actually acting. And now this guy's got a bit of a problem, because he's looking at it, and he's looking at what they've just done. They've all chosen line A as being the longest one, and it's clearly the wrong answer. And so therefore, what does he do? And it puts the person into incredible stress and a dilemma, because he knows what he's seeing, but he's also had a look at what these other people have done, and the social pressure is unbearable. So reluctantly he conforms. He marks the same as the other 3. And even though he knows, this is what's important, that what he's doing is wrong, this is the really important part, he still does it, because the power of conforming overpowers his rational judgment. He cannot bear to be the one who stands out. So he just decides perhaps he better conform, or perhaps he's lost his mind. So what the experiment Asch did, and there was various different types of the same experiment, what it shows is that people will always do what the group do, even if they think the group are wrong, because it's safety in numbers, and they're not going to trust themselves. They will go with the flow, with very few exceptions. So that's what the Asch experiment was showing, that people are willing to abandon their own reasoning if it means they'll fit in. Next up is an experiment or study by Stanley Milgram, who produced some of the most fantastic human studies there's ever been. And what Milgram did was he advertised for a bunch of people to be hired, say for a day, paid a reasonable amount of money, nothing fantastic, but a reasonable amount for working with a psychological study. I think it was called something to do with administration or some type of system, but it wasn't. I think, in fact, it was seen to be a memory test. So people were hired to work on a test of memory, and what this meant was there was a guy in a white coat who would be the authority figure, and someone would sit on a chair, and there'd be a partition, and at the other side of that partition was the person who was getting asked questions. And on the side of the partition where the person was asking the questions, he would have a bank of little switches, and the authority figure would say to the person, ask the man behind the partition the question, and ask this, that, whatever, and if the person comes back with the right answer, fine, but if they come back with the wrong answer, they get it wrong, then we're going to have to punish them. So therefore, you'll see a row of switches there, and give them a very mild electric shock. 15 volts. So what people would do is they would be willing to go through with the experiment, ask the questions, the person at the other side would get something wrong, the person at the other side of the partition, unseen, was part of the experiment. They were an actor. And the person conducting, the authority figure conducting the experiment in the white coat, was also an actor. Who was being studied was the person who was willing to ask the questions and then give someone a mild electric shock of 15 volts, just enough to slightly nip them if they got it wrong. And it was an experiment in memory and reward and punishment for doing well or not. So as the experiment went on, and the person behind the partition, who's an actor, got more questions wrong, the experimenter authority figure says, okay, increase the voltage, go to 30 volts, give the person a stronger shock for getting it wrong again. And this would continue up until behind the partition the person was saying, I don't want any more shocks, I've had enough of this, and it would be up by this time about midway level. The person was getting 100 volts and was acting in pain. There wasn't any electricity connected at all, it was all just an act. But what was important here was the person kept doing it because the authority figure kept saying, just go ahead. And the shocking thing, pun intended, was most of the people were willing to go right up to the very last switch, which is 400 volts, and electrocute the person. At some point, the person at the other side of the partition was screaming, I can't take any more, don't give me any more shocks. And the man in the white coat would say, just continue with the experiment. And the vast majority of people electrocuted the person. That's what they thought they were doing. And then there would be silence from the other side, and they would carry on administrating the shocks. And what this shows you was the incredible conformity to authority, even if it means electrocuting someone to death. And this was a study with normal people who wouldn't do that, but under authority, under command, they were willing to electrocute someone. That was the Milgram experiment. 10 years later, we had the Zimbardo experiment, where they advertised for people who wanted to take part in a social experiment, and when they got their details and how much they'd be getting paid. They were hoping people would maybe last a couple of weeks, and they were saying this is what you get, and it's you spend the day doing this and doing that, and you'll get a modest amount of money for a couple of weeks. So they hired all these people, explained the experiment. They said it's to do with social attitudes and this and that. And so what happened was they drew lots, and say there was about 20 people, 10 people became guards, prison guards, and the other 10 became prisoners, and they were acting in a role play situation. So they conducted the experiment, and the prisoners were then treated as prisoners and put into humiliating kind of gowns, and the guards were given special uniforms and a hat and certain things to make them more important and authority. Remember, these are all just normal people. Neither of them are actually a guard or a prisoner. They were just being role plays. But the experiment was so successful that they had to abandon it early because it was getting out of hand, because the guards were becoming too authoritative and going out of their way to humiliate the prisoners, who were actually just the same people as them. They're just people who were being hired for the experiment. And a lot of the prisoners wanted to just end it and forfeit their pay because they just couldn't take it anymore. And some of the guards wanted to carry on doing it without any pay at all. They wanted the experiment to continue. So very quickly, people went into roles and saw each other as through the role that had been appointed. And this was, it didn't really look good for human nature there, because very quickly people were willing to become abusive simply because they were allowed to. So that's 3 quite important experiments which you can apply to how people behave these days.